The cold in Alaska doesn't just bite, it devours. It seeps into the bones, crawls beneath the skin, and gnaws quietly until everything inside you goes still. Harlow's Edge was the kind of place where that kind of cold didn't just live in the air. It lived in the people. A small town tucked between the vast mountain ranges and an endless stretch of dark pine forest. It was a place that looked peaceful from afar. Smoke rising from chimneys, the dull orange glow of lamps behind frosted windows, the occasional crunch of boots over packed snow. But beneath that stillness was a silence so deep it felt alive, like the land itself was listening. In the winter of 1996, when the night stretched longer than anyone could remember, that silence broke. The first body was found in early December by a hunter named Dale Renner. He'd been tracking caribou near the frozen banks of Red Creek when he stumbled upon it. A young woman, maybe in her 20s, lying in the snow as if she had been placed there gently. Around her body was a perfect circle made of smooth river stones, each one cleaned and arranged with eerie precision. Her face was pale, serene almost as though she were sleeping. But what stopped Dale cold wasn't the sight of her lifeless eyes. It was the single black raven feather resting on her chest, straight and centered, unmoved by the wind. Sheriff Bill Corcoran arrived hours later. He was a man hardened by winters and whiskey, a local who had served the town since before most of its residents were born. He'd seen his share of accidents, fights, and deaths, snowmobile crashes, suicides, drunken disputes turned bloody, but nothing like this. There were no footprints around the body, no signs of struggle. The snow was untouched except for Dale's tracks. It was as though the killer, or whatever had done this, had come from the air itself. The autopsy revealed little. No visible wounds, no signs of assault. The woman identified as Clara Weston had simply stopped breathing. Her heart gave out, though the coroner couldn't explain why. She hadn't frozen to death. It was as if her body had surrendered peacefully to something unseen. Corcoran spent nights staring at her photographs under the dim light of his office, wondering what kind of monster could kill like that. 2 weeks later, it happened again. This time it was a man named Frank Doyle, a mechanic who ran the only repair shop in town. His body was found deeper in the woods, arranged in the same strange circle of stones. The raven feather lay on his chest like a mark of ownership. And once again, no tracks, no blood, no cause of death. Corcoran felt something inside him crack. He stopped sleeping. He began keeping the station lights on through the night, convinced that if he turned them off, the darkness outside would swallow the building whole. By Christmas, the entire town was drowning in fear. Children were kept indoors. Men patrolled their porches with rifles, and even the bars closed early. The locals started whispering that it wasn't a person at all. It was something older. Something from the woods. Corcoran dismissed it at first. Just panic and small-town superstition. But when the third body appeared, his conviction began to melt away like snow in spring. The third victim was an old trapper named Jonas Pike. He was found on the edge of the frozen lake, his face turned toward the horizon as if he'd been watching something approach. His dogs were gone, their leashes snapped, and his campfire had been neatly extinguished. Once again the circle. Once again the feather. That night, Corcoran stood at the site long after everyone had gone. The stars burned cold above him, the wind whispering through the trees. He stared at the circle and felt something he hadn't felt since he was a boy. A kind of primitive dread, the kind that comes when you know you're being watched. He turned slowly toward the forest, his flashlight cutting through the fog. For a second, he thought he saw movement. A figure, tall and still, standing just beyond the light's reach. When he blinked, it was gone. Back at the station, Corcoran poured himself a drink and opened his old case files. He searched for patterns, connections, anything. It took hours before he noticed it. A small detail buried in an old photo. The three victims, years earlier, had all attended the same summer camp as children, a short-lived program run by a church group near the foothills. He found a faded group picture from 1972. There they were, Clara Weston, Frank Doyle, Jonas Pike, smiling, young, innocent. Behind them, the dense shadow of pine trees. But there was something else in that photo. Just at the edge of the frame, half hidden by the trees, was a figure. It was tall, wearing what looked like a long, dark coat. Corcoran tried to enlarge it, but the face was just a blur. Still, something about the shape unsettled him. The stillness, the way it seemed to be watching. He felt a chill crawl up his neck. The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and unanswered calls. State investigators came and went, blaming the conditions, the isolation, the lack of evidence. They called it a dead end. But Corcoran couldn't let it go. He filled his office walls with photos, maps, strings of red thread connecting names and places. His deputies started to avoid him, muttering that the sheriff was losing it. One night, as the snowstorm raged outside, Corcoran found himself drawn to the evidence locker. He took out one of the feathers collected from the crime scenes, holding it under the dim bulb. It was blacker than any bird feather he'd seen, its edges shimmering faintly as if coated with frost. He ran his finger along the spine, and for a split second he swore he felt a pulse faint and rhythmic like a heartbeat. He dropped it immediately, his chest tight, his breath shallow. He started drinking more after that, sleeping less. People said he talked to himself, mumbling about voices in the wind. His reports became erratic. Pages filled with strange symbols, sketches of ravens, and notes about the whisper that comes from the pines. The official record shows that he filed his last report on January 16, 1997. The last line read, "He's not hunting us. He's remembering." After that, Corcoran stopped coming to work. A deputy found him a week later in his cabin, staring out the window toward the forest. He was alive, but his eyes looked hollow, distant. When asked what he saw out there, he only whispered, "He doesn't leave footprints." The case went cold. The files were sealed. Outsiders stopped asking questions, and the town buried its fear under snow and silence. But the story lingered in the air like smoke, whispered in bars, muttered by hunters, told by parents to keep their children from wandering too far. They called him the Whisper Man, the one who came for those who had sinned in the cold. And sometimes, on nights when the wind rose over the mountains and swept through the streets like a ghost's breath, old-timers claimed they could hear it, the faint sound of someone humming from the tree line, a low and haunting tune that didn't belong to any living soul. They said if you listened too long, if you tried to make out the words, the humming would stop, and you'd feel it then. A weight behind you, cold and patient, waiting for you to turn around. That winter marked the end of innocence for Harlow's Edge. The snow kept falling, covering everything, erasing tracks, softening graves. But the people who lived there never forgot the circles, the feathers, or the silence that followed. Because in Alaska, the cold never truly lets go, and neither do the dead. 26 years after the murders, the files of Harlow's Edge gathered more dust than any other in the Alaska State Police archives. The paper had yellowed, the ink faded, and even the photographs seemed drained of color, as though the cold had seeped into them too. But to one person, the chill in those files wasn't enough to keep her away. Detective Lena Marrow stared at the box marked Cold Case 0196, Harlow's Edge, and felt something stir, a pull she couldn't explain. She had reopened cases before, but this one felt personal, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Lena wasn't born in Alaska. She grew up in Chicago, where the streets buzzed with noise, where the sirens and shouts never stopped. Her work had earned her a reputation as a relentless investigator. She had helped track down a killer who left folded paper swans beside his victims, each one soaked in blood. That case had nearly broken her, but this one, she could tell even before she left her office, wasn't about madness or cruelty. It was about something older, quieter, and far more patient. The journey north was brutal. The small charter plane shuddered in the frozen wind as it descended toward the Harlow's Edge airstrip. From above, the town looked like a scatter of faint lights clinging to the edge of an abyss. The forest stretched endlessly, black and ancient, with white veins of snow cutting through it. When Lena stepped out into the cold, her breath froze instantly in the air. The silence hit her next. It wasn't emptiness, but a kind of presence. The kind that makes you feel watched. The locals hadn't changed much since the 90s. Same last names, same weathered faces, same fear of outsiders. When she checked into the only inn in town, the owner, a gray-haired woman with deep-set eyes, handed her the key wordlessly. On the wall behind the counter hung a faded photo of Sheriff Bill Corcoran. Someone had placed a small sprig of pine beside it like a memorial. The next morning, Lena went to the old sheriff's office, now barely used. The files were stored in a steel cabinet, each folder marked by a year. The folder for 1996 was thicker than she expected. Corcoran's handwriting filled every margin. Obsessive, frantic, underlined words that looked more like confessions than notes. He'd drawn circles over and over again, pages full of them. At the bottom of one sheet, in red ink, he had written, "He watches from the pines." Lena read every line, tracing his thought process like footprints in the snow. Corcoran had believed the victims were connected through their childhoods at St. Hilara's orphanage. The same camp photograph appeared in multiple files, the same blurry figure always lingering in the background. It should have been nothing, a trick of shadow, but it wasn't, not to her. When the sun began to set that first evening, the town's lights flickered on, dim and yellow. Lena sat in her rented SUV outside the diner, reviewing notes when an old man approached her window. His coat was worn, his beard frosted white. "You're the cop from down south," he said. She nodded. The man's eyes narrowed. "Don't go into those woods at night." His name was Henry Maddox, a trapper who'd lived near the forest for over 40 years. When Lena asked about the murders, his jaw tightened. He didn't speak for a long moment, just stared toward the tree line as the wind picked up. "I saw him," he finally said. "Back then, after the third one. Thought it was a hunter at first. Tall, wearing a long black coat. Just stood there. Didn't move, didn't speak. I watched him for minutes and the snow didn't touch him. Not a flake. Then I blinked and he was gone." Lena asked him how close he'd been. Maddox shook his head. "Doesn't matter. He wasn't really there." His voice trembled on the last word and she noticed his hands shaking. Before she could ask more, he turned and walked away into the snow, his figure disappearing like smoke. That night, Lena couldn't sleep. The wind outside sounded like whispers brushing against the glass. At first, she thought it was just exhaustion, but then something tapped. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on her window. She froze, the air thick in her lungs. The curtains moved slightly, just enough for her to see the outline of something dark standing beyond the glass. But when she blinked, it was gone. In the morning, she went to the forest. She told herself it was to gather evidence, to see the crime scenes herself. But deep down, she felt pulled there, as though the woods had been waiting for her too. She parked near the frozen creek, wrapped her coat tighter and stepped into the silence. The snow muffled every sound. Her boots crunched softly with each step. After 20 minutes of walking, she found it, an open clearing that matched the photos from the file. The snow had settled deep, but beneath it she could see faint shapes, stones arranged in a circle. Her pulse quickened. She knelt and brushed the snow away with her gloved hand. The stones were smooth, almost polished. In the center of the circle lay a black feather. It was fresh, untouched by frost. She stood perfectly still, every instinct in her body screaming that she wasn't alone. The trees swayed slightly, the air heavy with the scent of pine and something else, something metallic old. She turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. But there was a sound, faint and distant like humming. A man's voice, deep and slow, drifting on the wind. Lena backed away from the circle, keeping her flashlight trained on the trees. The humming stopped. Then the forest went completely silent, as if holding its breath. She hurried back to her SUV, locking the doors the second she climbed in. Her hands shook so badly she could barely turn the key. The headlights cut through the dark as she drove back toward town. refusing to look in the rearview mirror even once. Back at the inn, she tried to rationalize what she'd seen. Maybe a prank. Maybe someone knew she was reopening the case and wanted to scare her. But something inside her knew that wasn't true. She pulled out the files again, flipping to the original scene photos. The stones were identical in pattern to what she had just seen. But there was one difference. In one of Corcoran's old photos, she noticed something faint in the snow behind the circle. A shadow, long and narrow, stretching toward the trees. The sheriff had circled it in red ink but never labeled it. As she studied it, she heard that same sound again, soft humming. Not from outside this time, but from the hallway beyond her door. It lasted only a few seconds, fading just as quickly as it came. She stood there, frozen, her heart hammering, staring at the door handle. It didn't move. She barely slept that night. Her dreams were filled with the sound of crunching snow and whispers too faint to understand. When morning came, she left early and drove to the address listed in the archives for the sheriff's widow. The house sat on a hill overlooking the frozen lake. The woman who opened the door was frail, her eyes clouded with age, but when Lena mentioned her husband's name, she froze. "I told them all not to come here again," the old woman said. Her voice was tired, almost afraid. He never stopped hearing it. Even after he quit. Even when he was dying, he said the same thing. "He's in the trees." Lena asked if her husband ever mentioned who he was. The woman hesitated, glancing toward the window. "He said it wasn't a person," she whispered. "Said it was something that remembered him. Something that wanted him to remember too." The rest of that day passed in a blur of interviews and dead ends. Every person she spoke to had the same hollow look, the same dread when the forest came up. That evening, as she returned to her car, she noticed something on the windshield. A black feather, slick with moisture, resting perfectly centered. She picked it up, feeling a pulse of cold through her glove, and let it fall. That night, she made one more trip into the woods. She had to see the other sites for herself to be sure. She found the second circle near the lake, half buried in snow. The third was deeper, near an old logging road. Each one was identical. Each one perfectly intact despite years of storms. And at each one, a single raven feather lay untouched, as though someone had just placed it there. When she finally turned back toward her vehicle, she saw something at the edge of the clearing. A figure, tall and still, standing among the trees. The coat was long, the face shadowed. For a heartbeat, she thought it might be another investigator, or maybe her eyes playing tricks. But then she realized the snow wasn't disturbed around him. No footprints, no breath, just stillness. She blinked, and he was gone. The wind howled through the pines, carrying a low whisper that almost sounded like her name. She ran, heart pounding, back to the safety of the SUV. As she drove away, she didn't notice the faint shape in her rear window. A handprint, frost spreading from its center, as though something cold had touched the glass from the inside. Lena didn't tell anyone what she saw in the woods that night. She wrote it in her notes, yes, but not the official report. The department wouldn't understand, and she didn't want to give them reason to pull her off the case. She convinced herself it had to be a trick of the light, exhaustion, maybe even suggestion after reading Corcoran's journals. But deep down she knew better. The forest didn't just hold history, it held memory, and she had seen it looking back at her. The next morning, she drove to Fairbanks to find whatever was left of St. Ilara's orphanage. The building itself was long gone, burned to the ground in 1975, but the archives of the old diocese were still kept in the regional records office. It took hours of persuasion and a few calls to Anchorage before the caretaker allowed her access. Inside a locked storage room, she found them. Dust-covered boxes marked St. Ilara's Home for Boys and Girls. The files smelled of old smoke and mildew. She sifted through attendance lists, maintenance records, and faded letters until she found something that froze her blood. A list of missing children from the year before the fire. 7 names. All unaccounted for, all marked, presumed deceased. At the bottom of the page, Written in neat cursive was a note. Incident reported by maintenance worker Elias Crow. She found another folder with his name. A janitor employed from 1970 to 1975. No criminal record, no family. Terminated after exhibiting signs of instability. The report described him as obsessed with the forest, claiming he would wander at night, whispering prayers into the trees. The head nun wrote that he often told the children, "The woods forgive what people cannot." Lena flipped through photographs and found one from 1974. Children gathered around a campfire, smiling awkwardly at the camera. In the background stood a tall figure in a long coat. The eyes were lost in shadow, but she could see the faint outline of something in his hand. A feather. Her stomach twisted. Elias Crow. The man the town had forgotten. The name that had disappeared from all other records. She searched public archives, local obituaries, even police logs, nothing. It was as if he had vanished completely the year of the fire. She stayed in Fairbanks that night, unable to shake the feeling that she'd stirred something that should have been left buried. Around 2 a.m, she woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway of her motel. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. She waited, listening, holding her breath. The steps stopped outside her door. Then came 3 soft knocks, the same rhythm as before. She stood frozen in the dark, gripping her gun. But when she finally opened the door, the hallway was empty. Only a single black feather lay on the floor, glistening faintly as though it had been wet. When dawn came, she drove back to Harlow's Edge. The air felt heavier now, the sky darker even in daylight. On the drive, she noticed something strange. Every time she glanced at the tree line, she thought she saw movement. A flicker of something tall keeping pace with her car just beyond the trees. But each time she turned her head to look directly, there was nothing. Back in town, she visited the library, hoping to find old newspaper clippings about the orphanage fire. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with quiet eyes, hesitated when Lena mentioned St. Hilara's. "That place," she murmured, "was cursed. The fire wasn't an accident, no matter what they said. Folks around here believed Crow started it, but no one could prove it. Some said he'd gone mad, talking about cleansing souls in the cold. Said he'd found something in those woods that spoke to him." Lena asked what that meant, but the woman didn't answer. She only said, "If you've been out there, you should leave. The longer you stay, the easier it is for it to notice you." That night, Lena returned to her cabin at the edge of town. The snow outside had deepened and the forest loomed black and silent beyond the porch. She sat by the fire, reading Corcoran's last entries again. His handwriting grew shakier as the pages went on, his words more desperate. "He doesn't die," one page read. "He changes faces. He listens through the trees. He knows the names of those who remember." The last note was written in red, underlined twice. "He is not a man. He is the cold itself." The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows. She told herself it was just the storm, but when she turned toward the window, her breath caught. A figure stood near the tree line, tall and unmoving, half shrouded in mist. She blinked and it was gone. When she stepped outside moments later, she found no tracks in the snow. None. Only a faint circle of stones near the edge of the woods. In the center lay another feather. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, but it didn't feel like a normal feather. It felt almost alive, the shaft pulsing faintly, cold but rhythmic, like a slow heartbeat. She dropped it instantly and backed away, stumbling toward the cabin. The door creaked behind her as she slammed it shut, locking it twice. The fire crackled violently, sparks leaping upward as if reacting to her fear. She barely slept. When she did, her dreams were filled with voices, children whispering in the dark, calling her name. She saw flashes of the orphanage, the walls burning, smoke curling around a shadowed figure that didn't flinch even as the flames consumed everything. In the dream, the figure turned toward her, and she saw its face for the first time. Elias Crow's eyes, empty and black, reflecting the firelight. He smiled and whispered, "The circle never breaks." Lena woke drenched in sweat, gasping. She grabbed her recorder and spoke into it, her voice shaking. "If anyone finds this, Elias Crow was real. He worked at St. Alara's. I think he's connected to the murders. But there's something else. He's not gone. I've seen him." By afternoon, she'd made up her mind. She had to find where he died or where he'd gone. She studied old maps of the area and found the orphanage's original location near the foothills, about an hour's drive from town. The site was supposed to be empty, but locals claimed nothing grew there anymore, not even moss. She packed her camera, flashlight, and recorder and left before sunset. As she drove, the snow began to fall harder, the road vanishing beneath white dust. The forest closed in around her, the pines bending under the weight of ice. Her headlights caught flashes of movement, branches snapping, shadows darting between trees. She gripped the wheel tighter, heart racing, whispering to herself to stay calm. When she finally reached the site, she almost didn't recognize it. The ground was flat, covered in uneven mounds of snow. The remnants of stone foundations poked through the frost like bones. She stepped out of the SUV and scanned the area with her flashlight. The silence was suffocating, and then she saw it. A ring of stones, larger than the others, perfectly round. In the center, something jutted from the snow, a wooden cross weathered and blackened by age. As she approached, her flashlight flickered. She knelt to brush the snow away and found letters carved into the wood. E. Crow. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked around, heart hammering, every instinct screaming at her to leave, but she couldn't. Something compelled her to keep looking, to understand. She pulled her recorder out again and pressed record. "This is Detective Lena Marrow. I found what appears to be the grave of Elias Crow at the site of St. Alara's orphanage. The area is surrounded by..." She stopped. The sound of movement. Behind her. A crunch of snow. She turned slowly, the flashlight trembling in her hand. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure, tall, motionless, face obscured by shadow. The light hit the coat first. Long, black, old. She raised the flashlight higher, her pulse thundering in her ears, but the beam distorted as if the air itself warped around him. The shadows clung to his face, and yet she could feel his eyes on her. Cold, patient, ancient. Her breath came out in white clouds. She managed one word, barely a whisper. "Crow?" No answer. The figure didn't move. Then slowly, deliberately, he lifted his hand. Between his fingers was a single raven feather. He let it fall, and as it hit the snow, the world seemed to stop. The forest went silent. Her flashlight died. The last thing Lena heard before everything went dark was a voice, low and close, whispering near her ear. The circle remembers. When her flashlight flickered back to life seconds later, the figure was gone. The clearing was empty, but her badge, her own badge, lay in the snow within the circle of stones as though it had been waiting for her all along. She stared at it in disbelief, realizing she hadn't dropped it, hadn't even touched it since leaving the cabin. The wind stirred softly, carrying with it the faintest sound of humming. She backed away slowly, her heart pounding. She didn't notice that her own footprints, moments after she made them, were filling in with snow faster than they should have, as if the forest itself didn't want anyone to know she had ever been there. The final entry in Lena Marrow's field journal was dated January 8, 2023. The handwriting was wild, uneven, as though her hands were shaking while she wrote. It filled 7 pages, each more desperate than the last, and though the words seemed scattered, a single phrase appeared over and over again. "He isn't gone. He never was." That was the last trace of her anyone ever saw. 3 days later, a truck driver heading north toward Harlow's Edge spotted a black SUV parked by the side of the road, engine still running, headlights piercing the dark. Snow had already begun to swallow the tires. Inside, the driver's seat was empty, the door ajar, and a leather-bound notebook sat open on the passenger seat. The pages were wet and warped from melted snow. but the ink hadn't faded completely. Whoever read it first described feeling as if someone was standing behind them, breathing softly against their neck. The search began at dawn. The local rangers, joined by a handful of state troopers, combed through the forest where Lena's tire tracks disappeared. They found nothing, no footprints, no broken branches, not even the disturbed snow that would have marked a struggle. Only one of the rangers claimed to hear something that morning, a low humming sound, rhythmic, distant, like a man's voice carried by the wind. The others said it was the trees bending under the frost. But the ranger swore it wasn't. He said it sounded almost like a lullaby. Back in town, the sheriff's office received a package 2 weeks later. No return address, no fingerprints, just a plain cardboard box wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a cassette tape, a battered micro recorder, and a single raven feather laid neatly on top. The note inside said only 3 words: "Play this at dusk." They did. The room was quiet when the recording began. Static filled the first few seconds, then a woman's voice broke through. The sharp, shaky breaths of Lena Marrow. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "The air hums here. It hums like something alive. He's in the trees. I saw him again." A sound followed, a faint scraping like boots dragging over ice. Her breathing quickened. "The faces," she whispered. "The ones from the photos. They're not gone. They're here. I saw Clara Weston." She smiled at me. Her eyes were black like the sky before snow. "He said the circle never ends." He said, then silence. The recording crackled again, softer this time, and a man's voice began to hum that same haunting melody. Deep, slow, each note colder than the one before. The recording ended abruptly, the tape snapping. The officers didn't finish listening. They turned it off, sealed it, and sent it to Anchorage for analysis. It disappeared in transit. After Lena's disappearance, no one volunteered to continue the investigation. The locals had seen enough, lost enough. They said some cases were better left unsolved because truth itself could be a kind of curse. Yet the town never quite recovered. Hunters began reporting strange things again. Perfect circles of stones found deep in the woods, arranged so precisely that even the wind refused to disturb them. Others claimed to see faint lights flickering between the trees, bluish and distant like lanterns swaying in an invisible hand. A hiker from Anchorage went missing that same spring. When search parties found his campsite, the fire was still burning, the tent untouched, and his journal lay open beside the embers. The last entry read, "Something whispered my name in the dark." It sounded like a man, but it came from the ground. People started leaving Harlow's Edge after that. Families packed their belongings and headed south toward the coast, saying the winters had grown meaner, that the forest didn't feel right anymore. The old-timers stayed, the ones who remembered Sheriff Corcoran, who remembered 1996, who remembered the fear. They nailed their windows shut, lit candles through the long nights, and told their children never to go near the woods when the wind was whispering. By 2025, the population of Harlow's Edge had dropped by half. The remaining residents rarely spoke of Lena Marrow or of the others before her. But everyone remembered the stories. The whispering man, the feathers, the circles, and sometimes, when the temperature dropped below zero and the mist rolled in from the mountains, they said you could see footprints appear in the snow where no one walked, leading toward the forest and never back out again. There's a bar near the old main road where the few remaining locals gather on winter nights. The owner, a man named Roland Graves, keeps an old police badge framed on the wall behind the counter. He found it one morning lying on his porch, half covered in frost. Lena Marrow's name was engraved on the back. He doesn't talk about it much, but once, after too many drinks, he told a traveler that the badge was still warm when he picked it up, as though someone had just been holding it. No one drives through Harlow's Edge at night anymore. Truckers take longer routes, and even the state troopers avoid patrols near the tree line after dark. The old station is still there, abandoned, its windows clouded with ice. Inside, the bulletin board still holds the 3 photographs of the 1996 victims, each surrounded by circles drawn in red pen. But there's a fourth photo now, taped in the corner, faded and grainy. It's of Lena, smiling faintly in her department ID picture. Someone, no one knows who, drew a circle around her face too. And yet the strangest part of all is that the story doesn't end there. Every few winters, long after new snow has buried the old, someone will find a new set of stones arranged in the same perfect shape, always at the edge of the woods. Sometimes there's a feather, sometimes a name scratched faintly into the bark of a nearby tree. Always the same message he remembers. People who have lived long enough say the forest takes what it's owed. They say Elias Crow wasn't the beginning of it. He was just another vessel. They say he heard something in those woods that was never meant to be heard. An ancient rhythm in the wind. A hum that seeps into you until you're not yourself anymore. The woods chose him once. Maybe they chose Lena too. In early autumn of 2024, a wildlife photographer passing through the area captured an image that would reignite the legend. It showed the frozen lake under a pale sunrise, the surface dusted with frost. Near the tree line, half hidden in fog, a figure stood, tall, thin, unmoving. Zoomed in, the details were blurry, but the outline was clear enough to make your stomach tighten. The coat, the stillness, and at the figure's feet a circle of stones. The photographer didn't stay to investigate. He packed up and drove through the night, leaving his equipment behind. Later, he told a reporter that he had felt something while taking the picture. Pressure like invisible hands on his shoulders, and a sound in his ears that wasn't the wind. It was humming. The authorities dismissed it. They always do. They called it folklore, a trick of the light, mass hysteria shaped by cold and isolation. But those who have lived through Alaska's long winters know that some things don't vanish just because people stop believing. They wait, they listen. They find new names to whisper. Even now, when the night stretches too long and the wind starts to echo between the trees, the people of Harlow's Edge close their curtains and turn up the radio to drown out the noise. Because if you listen closely, you can still hear it. A man's voice humming softly from the forest, steady and patient, as if keeping time with your heartbeat. And sometimes, if the snow falls just right, you might look out and see a raven feather drifting down, spinning gently until it lands on your doorstep. When that happens, the old folks say don't touch it. Don't pick it up. And above all, don't listen. Because once you hear the whisper, once it knows your name, the circle begins again. The last light of Harlow's Edge flickers still, buried beneath the cold. The snow covers its secrets, but the ground remembers every step, every breath, every sound ever made in its silence. The forest is patient. It doesn't chase, it waits. And in that endless waiting it hums, softly, endlessly, the tune of something ancient and eternal. Something that began long before men gave it a name, and will continue long after they're gone. So if you ever find yourself on the Alaskan highway on a night when the fog rolls thick and the pines bend low, and you pass a sign half buried in frost that reads Harlow's Edge, Population 42, don't stop. Don't look toward the woods. Keep driving. Because somewhere out there, in the dark between the trees, a man in a black coat might still be standing perfectly still, holding a single raven feather, waiting for someone to listen.